In Unit 3, I want to discuss with you the challenges and the reforms and give you the big picture. The question that we're addressing here really have to do with what governments should do and how should government proceed in doing what they do. And I know these are very general questions, but they're really important ones, right? Because they really are the two pillars around which a lot of scholars and policy thinkers, lobbyists think and criticize government. We are also looking at how government has been, in a way, challenged, both nationally but also internationally. There are, for instance, since the 1970s, very clear perception and very clear ideas that have been developed that are very critical of the post-Second World War welfare state form of government. And Canada has not been protected by or anything specific, but has had to adapt basically to this kind of criticism. Some of those ideas point to very specific policies, especially redistributive policies such as, social policies, educational policies, health policies, and so on and so forth, that have been perceived as ineffective or poorly managed or costing too much money in a context where citizens are not willing to pay more taxes. There also are criticism about perceived issues of freedom, perceived issues of increased regulation that limit people's ability to innovate, restrict markets, creativity as well, and but also restrict social relationships. And so what we have here is a context that is quite critical of a model of government that existed in the 1950s, 60s, 70s that was quite successful, but has been really on the defensive since then, right? One ongoing crisis is the fiscal crisis. The fact that most Western governments have been completely unable to balance budgets, have always spent more money than their tax revenues, at least perceived as such, right? The story is that governments have debts. And the story is that these debts are not paid down. And that even governments such as, for instance, if we look at Margaret Thatcher in the 1970s and 80s in the UK, which was adamant that she was going to reduce the debt, wasn't able to actually roll it back. So there are major issues that are always present to this day that have to do with this, in a way, rolling forward but rolling context of criticism of forms of governments. Other issues that are very important are well known today, issues of globalization. And what does this mean? The idea that globalization is affecting the way Canada, as one of the international actors, one member of the United Nations, is more and more interacting with other members of the United Nations in a lot of regulatory policy capacities. And we have to become aware of them. We have international treaties, we have international agreements, and so on and so forth, that are obviously core policy challenges to the country and to our modes of governance. Another very interesting criticism is the increased request for transparency and accountability. Governments have to be more transparent. Governments have to basically make it known how they basically do their business. It's not just what government should do, but it's also how governments do it. And there, the issue of transparency and accountability becomes really, really important. Canadians are requiring more transparency and accountability. So this is basically what we discussed in Unit 3. And some of the readings here are very interesting. 1970s, new public management literature. So I give you an example by Bourgon and Osborne, where you basically get a sense of, you know, the arguments behind the new public management, which I think really are interesting, right? The idea that government should basically let go of lots of services and basically should privatize or work with the private sector or non-profit organization. These ideas were not part of governing in the 1960s, 50s. A lot of in-house policies were implemented by government agencies. And today, it's much more in the partnering. So we have to become aware of this. We have to be fully cognizant of this transformation of government. Millard and Provan also discussed basically this relationship of competitive, collaborative relationship with different agencies inside government, outside government, in the public sector, in the private sector, in the non-profit sector, and basically how these develop certain forms of governance and interdependability. In other words, that, you know, they cannot do without each other, and that they really become, in a way, the different pieces of a puzzle for the implementation, the successful implementation of policies. Aucoin is quite an interesting piece as well. The piece that he's written here talks to us about how this new context, which is both more complex and involves many more types of actors inside and outside of government, also leads to more politicization, and where politics plays a greater role. So how do we understand this? What does this mean for us, for instance, if we work inside government, to become fully aware and abreast of these implications? And so by the end of this unit, I think you have a very good understanding of the, in a way, the history of the situation, which really is contemporary to us, right? It's this history that has built up between the 1970s and the 1990s and a little thereafter, and the progressive complexification of governance in Canada is really covered here by all these different challenges and the way the government, what the government does and how he does it. So with this, I'm going to conclude and tell you, you should do the reading. You should look at all the articles. You should be quite selective and efficient when you do these readings. And then you should address the question of the unit and engage in a discussion. Thank you very much.